June 27th, 1876. The air inside the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts was a thick, suffocating soup of vaporized whale oil, metallic dust, and the humid breath of 250 men. At precisely 6:42 in the morning, the rhythmic symphony of industry, the shrieking lathes, the rhythmic thud of trip hammers, and the grinding of gears, was pierced by a sound so small, yet so jarring, that it seemed to split the very foundation of the factory. In the corner of the main machine shop, a telegraph machine began to click. It wasn't the usual rhythmic chatter of supply orders or administrative banalities. This was a frantic staccato burst of Morse code that carried the chill of the Montana wilderness into the heart of New England. The operator's hand trembled as he scribbled the translation. The silence that followed didn't happen all at once. It rippled outward from the telegraph station like a shockwave. Belt-driven machines were powered down. The hiss of steam subsided. Men wiped blackened grease from their foreheads with grimy aprons and gathered around a single piece of paper nailed to the timber post of the inspection bay. 210 men dead, an entire battalion of the 7th Cavalry, wiped off the face of the earth. Among those staring at the ink-smudged paper was Thomas McCarthy. At 29 years old, McCarthy was already a veteran of the Armory's precision culture. He had started here as a boy of 14, his first job sweeping the razor-sharp curls of steel from beneath the heavy machinery. Now he was a senior inspector. His hands, though stained with the permanent black ink of gun oil, and were the most trusted instruments in the building. He was the man who gave a weapon its soul by stamping it fit for service. But as he read the name Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, McCarthy felt a cold stone form in his stomach. He didn't just see a military disaster, he saw a mechanical indictment. He looked down at his station where a row of Springfield Model 1873 rifles, the Trapdoors, lay waiting for his mark. He had inspected the very rifles that Custer's men had carried into the valley of the Little Bighorn. He had tested their extractors. He had felt the snap of their breech blocks. He had guaranteed their lethality. The news was a physical blow to the workers. These weren't just anonymous tools of war. They were the pride of Springfield. The Model 1873 was supposed to be the pinnacle of American ingenuity, the bridge between the musket-loading past and the rapid-fire future. Yet, the early whispers coming across the wires were poisonous. They spoke of jammed shells, of soldiers found dead with knives in their hands, desperately trying to pry spent cartridges from the chambers of their Springfield rifles, while the Sioux and Cheyenne closed in. The factory, once a cathedral of industry, suddenly felt like a tomb. McCarthy looked at the men around him, Irish immigrants who had fled famine, German machinists who lived for precision, and saw the same haunting question in their eyes. Did our craftsmanship fail? Did the steel we forged break when it mattered most? This is a story that history books often sanitize, focusing on Custer's ego or the tragedy of the plains. But the true story begins here, amidst the soot and the steam, where the men who built the weapons had to face the possibility that their masterpiece was actually a death trap. Before we descend into the smoke of the battlefield and the secrets of the machine shop, if you want to explore the gritty reality of how America was forged in fire and steel, make sure to subscribe. We are going beyond the myths to find the truth buried in the dirt of Montana and the ledgers of Massachusetts. To understand the weapon that would one day be blamed for the blood on a Montana hillside, we must first look at the ledger books of a dying nation. By 1865, the American Civil War had ended, leaving behind a landscape of charred cities and a mountain of debt that threatened to swallow the federal government whole. The United States Treasury was not just empty, it was hemorrhaging. Yet, in the silent arsenals of the North, there sat a surplus that was as impressive as it was obsolete. Nearly 1 million Model 1861 and 1863 Springfield muskets. These were the widowmakers of the Civil War. Beautiful, rugged, and reliable. But they were relics. They were muzzle loaders. In the time it took a soldier to stand up, bite a paper cartridge, pour powder, ram a lead ball down a 40-inch barrel, and prime a percussion cap, a modern enemy could have fired 10 times. The war had proven that speed was the only currency that mattered in combat. The damned Yankee rifles, the Spencer and Henry repeaters, had changed everything. Confederate soldiers, stuck with single-shot muskets, famously remarked that the Northerners had a rifle they could load on Sunday and shoot all week. The War Department faced a brutal, cold-blooded paradox. Every general knew that breech loading, the ability to slide a cartridge into the back of the gun while lying prone, was the future. It saved lives. It won battles. But to scrap 1 million functional muskets and manufacture a brand new fleet of repeating rifles would cost tens of millions of dollars, money the government simply did not have. Washington didn't need a revolution. They needed a miracle of thrift. They needed a way to turn a horse and buggy weapon into a steam engine killer without spending a fortune. Enter Erskine Allen, the master armourer at Springfield. Allen was a man of steel and soot, a genius of the machine shop who looked at 1 million obsolete muskets and didn't see junk. He saw a foundation. In 1865, he proposed a radical surgical procedure for firearms. His vision was deceptively simple. Don't throw the gun away, just cut off its head. Allen's design involved milling away the rear section of the old musket barrel and installing a hinged breech block. This block flipped upward and forward toward the muzzle, secured by a simple thumb latch. Because it opened like a cellar door or a trapdoor, the name stuck instantly. For the first time, a soldier didn't have to stand up and expose himself to enemy fire to reload. He could remain hidden in the tall grass, flip the door open, slide in a self-contained metallic cartridge, snap it shut, and fire. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. A seasoned infantryman went from firing 3 agonizingly slow rounds per minute to 12, 15, or even 20. The trapdoor was a masterpiece of compromise, an industrial hack that gave a bankrupt army the teeth of a modern lion. However, the birth of the Springfield Model 1873 wasn't a straight line. It was a gauntlet. From 1865 to 1872, the design went through a brutal evolution. The early versions, the Model 1866 and 1868, were tested on the bloody fringes of the Bozeman Trail. The reports coming back to the factory were a mixture of awe and horror. The rifle was fast, yes, but the ammunition was the Achilles heel. The early copper cartridges were soft. When the rifle got hot from rapid fire, the copper would expand and fuse to the inside of the chamber. By 1872, the US Army decided to settle the debate once and for all. They assembled a testing board at Springfield Armory and Governor's Island. They brought in 99 different rifle designs from the greatest gun makers in the world. They dragged them through salt water, buried them in sand, froze them in blocks of ice, and fired them until the wood stocks began to smoke. One by one, the complex, expensive European designs failed. But entry number 99, Allen's refined Springfield, stood defiant. It was the simplest to repair, the cheapest to build, and the most rugged in the hands of a common soldier. On June 20th, 1873, it became the official protector of the American Republic. It was chambered for the massive .45-70 cartridge, a thumb-sized hunk of lead backed by 70 grains of black powder. It was a weapon designed to kill a horse at half a mile. In the halls of the Springfield factory, the workers cheered. They had saved the government millions, and they believed they had given the American soldier the finest tool of war ever devised. Little did they know, the very thrift that made the rifle possible was weaving a shroud for the men of the 7th Cavalry. By 1873, the Springfield Armory was no longer just a factory. It had become a cathedral of American industrial might. Imagine a sprawling complex of brick and iron, where the air hummed with the power of the Mill River and the hiss of massive steam engines. This was the birthplace of precision. Here, over 250 men, a melting pot of Irish immigrants escaping the Great Famine, meticulous German machinists, and native-born New Englanders, toiled 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, to forge the future of the American Republic. The sound inside was a deafening metallic roar. Thousands of leather belts whirred overhead, transferring power from the central shafts to a forest of iron machines. There was the rhythmic, bone-shaking thud of trip hammers shaping red-hot steel, and the high-pitched scream of lathes carving out the rifling within the barrels. To a civilian, it was chaos. To Thomas McCarthy, it was a perfectly tuned instrument. In this cathedral, the concept of craftsmanship was evolving. The era of a single master gunsmith building a rifle from scratch was dead. Springfield had perfected the division of labour. Each worker was a hyper-specialist. One man did nothing but machine the triggers. Another spent his entire life fitting breech blocks. Another focused solely on the tempering of firing pins. They moved with muscle memory so profound that they could detect a flaw of 1/1000th of an inch, just by the vibration in their fingertips. At the heart of the woodworking shop stood the mechanical ghost of Thomas Blanchard. His revolutionary copying lathe was a marvel of the age. It didn't just carve wood, it cloned it. A master pattern of a rifle stock was placed on one side, and the machine's metal fingers followed its curves, simultaneously carving an identical twin out of a raw block of American walnut. This ensured that every Springfield model 1873 felt exactly the same in a soldier's hand, whether he was in the forests of Maine or the deserts of Arizona. Thomas McCarthy's station sat at the very end of this thunderous line. By the time a rifle reached his grease-stained workbench, it was a finished piece of lethal art. It had passed through dozens of hands. The barrel had been rifled with 3 precise grooves, twisted at a rate of 1 turn every 22 inches, a mathematical necessity to stabilize the heavy 405-grain lead bullet in flight. And McCarthy's job was the final inspection, a role of immense pressure. He wasn't just checking a product, he was auditing a life-saving device. He would snap open the trapdoor, clack, checking the tension of the extractor spring. He would run a gauged rod down the bore to ensure the rifling was flawless. He would test the hammer's fall, listening for the crisp, metallic strike that signalled a perfect ignition. If the rifle passed his rigorous scrutiny, McCarthy would take his inspector's stamp and press it into the walnut stock, just behind the trigger guard. This mark, known as a cartouche, was his personal signature. It was a promise to the soldier who would eventually carry it. I have seen this steel. I have tested this wood. It will not fail you. In 1873, they produced 70 rifles a day. By the time 1876 rolled around, on over 73,000 rifles had left the armory in heavy wooden crates, destined for frontier forts like Fort Abraham Lincoln. Every single one had been proof-tested, fired with a double-strength charge of powder designed to blow a weak barrel to pieces. If it survived McCarthy and the proof house, it was considered invincible. The workers took immense pride in their masterpiece. They believed they were building the ultimate shield for the American pioneer. But as McCarthy stamped the rifles destined for the 7th Cavalry in late 1874, he couldn't have known that even the most perfect machine is only as good as the system that supports it. The steel was strong, the inspection was flawless, but a shadow was falling over the Springfield Armory, a shadow cast by a river in Montana that none of these men would ever see. May 17th, 1876. The morning mist at Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory, was shattered not by a factory whistle, but by the brassy, defiant blare of Gary Owen. The 7th Cavalry was riding out. It was a spectacle of Victorian military ego. 12 companies of cavalry, over 700 men, and a massive wagon train stretching for miles across the prairie. At the head of this column rode George Armstrong Custer, the boy general. He was a man who lived for the spotlight, dressed in his fringed buckskins, his golden hair trimmed short for the campaign. To Custer and his officers, the Springfield Model 1873 rifles strapped to their saddles weren't just tools. They were the guarantee of victory. They believed that no savage force, no matter how numerous, could stand against the disciplined fire of the United States Army. But beneath the surface of this grand parade, a series of fatal decisions had already been made in the name of efficiency. First, there was the issue of the ammunition. To save money, the War Department had opted for copper-cased cartridges instead of the more expensive brass. Copper was soft. It was prone to expansion when heated. In the cool air of a testing range in Massachusetts, it worked fine. But in the 100-degree heat of a Montana summer, after 50 rapid shots, the copper would expand like a lung, gripping the inside of the rifle's chamber with a death clinch. Second was the training, or the lack of it. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry were a mix of veterans and raw recruits. Because black powder and lead were expensive, many of these men had only fired their new Springfield rifles a handful of times. They knew how to clean them, they knew how to carry them, but they didn't know how the metal would behave under the stress of a sustained firefight. As they marched deeper into the greasy grass region, the weight of the Springfield became a constant companion. A fully loaded soldier carried 100 rounds in his belt and saddlebags. It felt like an infinite supply. They were so confident that Custer famously turned down the offer of Gatling guns, the primitive machine guns of the era, believing they would only slow him down. He wanted speed. He wanted glory. He believed his trapdoors were enough. On the night of June 24th, as the scouts brought news of a massive encampment on the Little Bighorn River, the mood in the camp was electric. The soldiers sat by their fires, polishing the breech blocks McCarthy had inspected months earlier. They joked about how the Sioux would scatter at the first volley. They didn't see the trap closing. They didn't know that the Lakota and Cheyenne weren't just waiting. They were better armed than anyone in Washington dared to admit, carrying Henry and Winchester repeating rifles that could fire 16 shots for everyone from a Springfield. The stage was set for a collision between two worlds, the industrial precision of the Springfield Armory and the desperate, overwhelming fury of a people fighting for their existence. The thrift of the US government was about to meet the reality of the Montana dirt. June 25th, 1876, 3 p.m. The Montana sun was a searing eye in a cloudless sky, baking the ridges above the Little Bighorn River. The air was no longer filled with the smell of Springfield's oil. It was choked with the acrid, sulphurous fog of black powder and the copper tang of blood. The men of the 7th Cavalry were no longer a parade. They were a desperate circle of hunters who had become the hunted. As thousands of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors surged up the ravines, the soldiers did exactly what they were trained to do. They dropped to one knee, flipped open the trapdoor of their rifles, and sent 405 grains of lead screaming into the dust. For the first 10 minutes, the Springfield Model 1873 was a wall of thunder. The .45-70 rounds were devastating, dropping horses and warriors at distances the Indians' Winchesters couldn't reach. But then the thrift of Washington began to collect its debt. The rifles were getting hot, searingly hot. In the frantic pace of the fight, men were firing as fast as they could move their fingers. Inside the chambers, the fatal flaw Thomas McCarthy couldn't have seen in a cool factory began to manifest. The soft copper shells, heated by rapid combustion and the blistering sun, expanded. But unlike brass, they didn't spring back. They stayed expanded, gripping the steel walls of the chamber like a vice. The sound of the battle changed. The rhythmic volleys were replaced by the frantic clacking of breech blocks being slammed, and then silence. A soldier would pull the thumb latch, but the trap door wouldn't budge. Or worse, the breech would open, but the extractor, that small hook of steel meant to pull the spent shell out, would simply shear through the soft copper rim, leaving the empty casing stuck deep inside the barrel. In that moment, the Springfield Model 1873 was no longer a state-of-the-art weapon. It was a 9-pound club. Archaeologists digging at the battlefield decades later would find the evidence of this mechanical nightmare. They found cartridges with deep gouges in the rims where soldiers had used their pocket knives to desperately pry the shells out, while warriors closed in with tomahawks. Imagine the terror, the smell of the enemy's horses, the screams of the dying, and your only hope for survival is a piece of stuck copper that won't move. On Custer's last stand hill, the precision of Springfield met the volume of the frontier. While the soldiers struggled with their jammed single shots, the warriors were pouring a continuous stream of fire from their 16-shot Winchester repeaters. It wasn't just a battle of men. It was a battle of philosophies. The army had chosen power and economy over speed and reliability. As the sun began to set, the last rhythmic thud of a Springfield was heard. Then, only the wind. In the pockets of the dead, rescuers would later find knives with broken blades. Final, silent witnesses to a mechanical betrayal that cost 210 men their lives. Back in Massachusetts, the machines at the armory were still humming, unaware that their masterpiece had just failed its most important test. The thrift of a nation had just written a check that the 7th Cavalry had to pay in blood.